The Pickwick Papers 1. The Pickwickians begin their adventures. They meet Mr. Alfred Jingle, and Winkle is involved in a duel. Once upon a time in London there was a club called the Pickwick Club. Mr. Samuel Pickwick, its founder and chairman, was a benevolent, simple-hearted old gentleman of some wealth, with a taste for science. He delighted to invent the most profound theories, to explain the most ordinary happenings, and to write long papers to be read before the club. He had a large bald head and eyes that twinkled behind round spectacles, and he made a speech with one hand under his coat-tails and the other waving in the air. His fellow members looked upon Mr. Pickwick as a very great man, and when he proposed that he and 3 others form a corresponding society which should travel about and forward to the club accounts of their adventures, the idea was at once adopted. The 3 that Mr. Pickwick chose were named Tupman, Snodgrass, and Winkle. Tupman was middle-aged with a double chin, and was so fat that for years he had not seen the watch-chain that crossed his silk waistcoat. But he had a youthful, romantic disposition, and a great liking for the fair sex. Snodgrass, who had no parents, was a ward of Mr. Pickwick's, and imagined himself a poet. Winkle was a young man whose father had sent him to London to learn life. He wore a green shooting coat, and his great ambition was to be considered a sportsman, though at heart he was afraid of either a horse or a gun. With these 3 companions, Mr. Pickwick prepared to set out in search of adventures. Next morning, as he drove in a cab to the inn where all were to take the coach, Mr. Pickwick began to chat with the driver. The cabman amused himself by telling the most impossible things, all of which Mr. Pickwick believed. When he said his horse was 42 years old, and that he often kept him out 3 weeks at a time without resting, down it went in Mr. Pickwick's notebook as a wonderful instance of the endurance of horses. Unfortunately, however, the driver thought Mr. Pickwick was putting down the number of the cab so as to complain of him, and as they arrived just then at the inn, he jumped from his seat with the intention of fighting his dismayed passenger. He knocked off Mr. Pickwick's spectacles, and dancing back and forth as the other's 3 comrades rushed to the rescue, planted a blow in Mr. Snodgrass's eye, another in Tupman's waistcoat, and ended by knocking all the breath out of Winkle's body. From this dilemma they were rescued by a tall, thin, long-haired young man in a faded green coat, worn black trousers, and patched shoes, who seized Mr. Pickwick and lugged him into the inn by main force, talking with a jaunty, independent manner and in rapid and broken sentences.
"This, waiter. Where's your friends? All a mistake. Never mind. Here, waiter, brandy and water. Raw beefsteak for the gentleman's eye, eh? Ha ha!"
The seedy-looking stranger, whose name was Alfred Jingle, was a passenger on the same coach that day, and entertained the Pickwickians with marvellous stories of his life in Spain. None of these was true, to be sure, but they were all entered in Mr. Pickwick's notebook. In gratitude, that night the latter invited Jingle to dinner at the town inn where they stopped. The dinner was long, and almost before it was over not only Mr. Pickwick, but Snodgrass and Winkle also were asleep. Tupman, however, was more wakeful. A ball, the waiter had told him, was to be held that night on the upper floor, and he longed to attend it. Jingle readily agreed, especially when Tupman said he could borrow for him a blue dress suit, the property of the sleeping Winkle. They were soon dressed and at the ball. Jingle's jaunty air gained him a number of introductions. Before long he was dancing with a little old widow named Mrs. Budger, who was very rich, and to whom he at once began to make love. There was an army surgeon present named Slammer, a short, fat man with a ring of upright black hair around his head and a bald plain on top of it, who had been courting the rich widow himself. Dr. Slammer was old, Jingle was young, and the lady felt flattered. Every moment the doctor grew angrier, and at last tried to pick a quarrel with the wearer of the blue dress suit, at which Jingle only laughed. The ball over, Tupman and Jingle went downstairs. Winkle's clothes were returned to their place, and Jingle, promising to join the party at dinner next day, took his departure. The Pickwickians were hardly awake next morning when an army officer came to the inn inquiring which gentleman of their number owned a blue dress suit with gilt buttons. When told that Mr. Winkle had such a costume, he demanded to see him, and at once, in the name of his friend Dr. Slammer, challenged him to fight a duel that night at sunset. Poor Winkle almost fainted with surprise. When the stranger explained that the wearer of the blue suit had insulted Dr. Slammer, Winkle concluded that he must have drunk too much wine at dinner, changed his clothes, gone somewhere, and insulted somebody, of all of which he had no recollection. He saw no way, therefore, but to accept the bloodthirsty challenge, hoping that something would happen to prevent the duel. Winkle was dreadfully afraid, for he had never fired a pistol in his life. He chose Snodgrass for his second, hoping the latter would tell Mr. Pickwick. But Snodgrass, he soon found to his dismay, had no idea of doing so. The day wore heavily away, and Winkle could think of no escape. At sunset they walked to the appointed spot, a lonely field, and at last Winkle found himself, pistol in hand, opposite another man armed likewise, and waiting the signal to shoot. At that moment Dr. Slammer saw that the man he faced was not the one who had insulted him at the ball. Explanations were soon made, and the whole party walked back together to the inn, where Winkle introduced his new friends to the Pickwickians. Jingle, however, was with the latter, and Dr. Slammer at once recognized him as the wearer of the blue dress suit. The doctor flew into a rage, and only the statement of his fellow officer that Jingle was not a gentleman, but a strolling actor far beneath the doctor's dignity, prevented an encounter. As it was, Slammer stumped off in anger, leaving the Pickwickians to enjoy the evening in their own way. 2. Tupman has a love affair with a spinster, and the Pickwickians find out the real character of Jingle. Next day a military drill was held just outside the town, and the Pickwickians went to see it. In the confusion of running officers and prancing horses, they became separated from one another. Mr. Pickwick, Snodgrass, and Winkle found themselves between two lines of troops in danger of being run down. At this moment they saw Tupman standing in an open carriage near by, and hurrying to it, were hoisted in. The carriage belonged to a short, stout old gentleman named Wardle, who had attended some of the club's meetings in London, and knew Mr. Pickwick by sight. He lived at a place nearby called Dingley Dell, from which he had driven to see the drill, with his old maid sister and his own 2 pretty daughters. Fastened behind was a big hamper of lunch, and on the box was a fat boy named Joe, whom Wardle kept as a curiosity because he did nothing but eat and sleep. Joe went on errands fast asleep, and snored as he waited on the table. He had slept all through the roaring of the cannon, and the old gentleman had to pinch him awake to serve the luncheon. They had a merry time that day, Tupman being deeply smitten with the charms of the elderly Miss Wardle, and Snodgrass no less in love with Emily, one of the pretty daughters. When the review was over, the old gentleman invited them all to visit Dingley Dell next day. Early in the morning they set out, Mr. Pickwick driving Tupman and Snodgrass in a chaise, while Winkle rode on horseback to uphold his reputation as a sportsman. Mr. Pickwick was distrustful of the horse he hired, but the ostler assured him that even a waggon load of monkeys with their tails burnt off would not make him shy. Winkle had never ridden a horse before, but he was ashamed to admit it. For a while all went well. Then the luckless Winkle dropped his whip, and when he dismounted, the horse would not let him mount again. Mr. Pickwick got out of the chaise to help, and at this the animal jerked the bridle away and trotted home. Hearing the clatter, the other horse bolted too. Snodgrass and Tupman jumped for their lives, and the chaise was smashed to pieces against a wooden bridge. With difficulty the horse was freed from the ruins, and leading him, the four friends walked the 7 miles to Dingley Dell, where they found Mr. Wardle and the fat boy, the latter fast asleep as usual, posted in the lane to meet them. Brushes, a needle and thread, and some cherry brandy soon cured their rents and bruises, and they forgot their misfortunes in an evening of pleasure. Mr. Wardle's mother was a deaf old lady with an ear-trumpet who loved to play whist. When she disliked a person, she would pretend she could not hear a word he said. But Mr. Pickwick's jollity and compliments made her forget even to use her ear-trumpet. Tupman flirted with the spinster aunt, and Snodgrass whispered poetry into Emily's ear to his heart's content. Next morning Mr. Wardle took Winkle rook shooting. The pair set out with their guns, preceded by the fat boy and followed by Mr. Pickwick, Snodgrass, and the corpulent Tupman. Winkle, who disliked to admit his ignorance of guns, showed it in a painful way. His first shot missed the birds and lodged itself in the arm of Tupman, who fell to the ground. The confusion that followed cannot be described. They bound up his wounds and supported him to the house, where the ladies waited at the garden gate, Mr. Wardle calling out to them not to be frightened. The warning, however, had no effect on the spinster aunt. At the sight of her Tupman wounded, she began to scream. Old Mr. Wardle told her not to be a fool, but Tupman was affected almost to tears, and spoke her name with such romantic tenderness that the poor foolish lady felt quite a flutter at her heart. A surgeon found the wound a slight one, and as a cricket match was to be played that day, the host left Tupman in the care of the ladies, and carried off the others to the game. When they reached the field, the first words that fell on Mr. Pickwick's ear made him start.
"This way. Capital fun. Glorious day. Make yourself at home. Glad to see you. Very."
It was Jingle, still clad in his faded green coat. He had fallen in with the visiting players, and by telling wonderful tales of the games he had played in the West Indies, soon convinced them he was a great cricket player. Seeing him greet Mr. Pickwick, Mr. Wardle, thinking him a friend of his guest, procured him an invitation to the dinner that followed the match. There Jingle made good use of his time in eating and drinking, and at midnight was heard leading with great effect the chorus, "We won't go home till morning." Meanwhile, the romantic Tupman at Dingley Dell had been free to woo the middle-aged spinster. This he did with such success that when evening came he and she sat together in a vine-covered arbour in the garden, like a pair of carefully folded kid gloves, bound up in each other. He had just printed a kiss on her lips, when both looked up to see the fat boy, perfectly motionless, staring into the arbour.
"Supper's ready,"
said the fat boy, and his look was so blank that they both concluded he must have been asleep and had seen nothing. It was long past midnight when a tremendous noise told that the absent ones had returned. All rushed to the kitchen, where Jingle's voice was heard crying,
"Cricket dinner. Glorious party. Capital songs. Very good. Wine, ma'am. Wine."
Mr. Pickwick, Snodgrass, and Winkle went to bed, but the talkative Jingle remained with the ladies, and before they retired had made Tupman almost mad with jealousy by his attentions to the spinster aunt, who showed herself greatly pleased with his politeness. Now, the fat boy, for once in his life, had not been asleep when he had announced supper that evening. He had seen Tupman's love-making, and took the first occasion to tell the deaf old lady as she sat in the garden arbour next morning. He was obliged to shout it in her ear, and thus the whole story was overheard by Jingle, who happened to be near. The deceitful Jingle saw in this a chance to benefit himself. The spinster, he thought, had money. What could he better do than turn her against Tupman and marry her himself? With this plan he went to Tupman, recited what the fat boy had told, and advised him for a time, in order to throw off the suspicions of the old lady and of Mr. Wardle, to pay special attention to one of the younger daughters, and to pretend to care nothing for the spinster. He told Tupman that the latter herself had made this plan, and wished him to carry it out for her sake. Tupman, thinking it the wish of his lady-love, did this with such success that the old lady concluded the fat boy must have been dreaming. The spinster, however, thought Tupman false, and Jingle used the next few days to make such violent love to her that the silly creature believed him, forgot Tupman, and agreed to run away with the deceiver to London. There was great excitement when their absence was discovered, and the wrathful Mr. Wardle and Mr. Pickwick pursued them at once in a 4-horse chaise. They rode all night, and reaching London, at once began to inquire at various inns to find a trace of the runaway pair. They came at length to one called the White Hart, in whose courtyard a round-faced manservant was cleaning boots. This servant, whose name was Samweller, wore a coat with blue glass buttons, a bright red handkerchief tied around his neck, and an old white hat stuck on the side of his head. He spoke with a quaint country accent, but he was a witty fellow with a clever answer for everyone.
"Very well, I'm agreeable,"
he said when Mr. Pickwick gave him a gold piece.
"What the devil do you want with me, as the man said when he see the ghost?"
With Sam Weller's aid, they soon found that Jingle and the spinster were there, and entered the room in which the couple sat at the very moment Jingle was showing the marriage licence which he had just brought. The spinster at once went into violent hysterics, and Jingle, seeing the game was up, accepted the sum of money which Mr. Wardle offered him to take himself off. There were deep lamentations when the confiding spinster found herself deserted by the faithless Jingle, and slowly and sadly Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Wardle bore her back to Dingley Dell. The heartbroken Tupman had already left there, and with feelings of gloom Mr. Pickwick, with Snodgrass and Winkle, also departed. 3. Mr. Pickwick has an interesting scene with Mrs. Bardell, his housekeeper. Further pursuit of Jingle leads to an adventure at a young ladies' boarding school. Mr. Pickwick lived in lodgings let for a single gentleman in the house of a Mrs. Bardell, a widow with one little boy. For a long time she had secretly adored her benevolent lodger as someone far above her own humble station. Mr. Pickwick had not forgotten Sam Weller, the servant who had aided in the pursuit of Jingle, and on returning to London he wrote asking Sam to come to see him, intending to offer him a position as body servant. Sam came promptly, and Mr. Pickwick then proceeded to tell his landlady of his plan, a more or less delicate matter, since it would cause some change in her household affairs.
"Mrs. Bardell," said he, "do you think it a much greater expense to keep 2 people than 1?"
"La, Mr. Pickwick," answered Mrs. Bardell, fancying she saw matrimony in his eye, "that depends on whether it's a saving person."
"Very true," said Mr. Pickwick, "but the person I have in my eye," here he looked at Mrs. Bardell, "has this quality, and to tell you the truth, I have made up my mind."
Mrs. Bardell blushed to her cap border. Her lodger was going to propose. "Oh, Mr. Pickwick," she said, "you're very kind, sir. I'm sure I ought to be a very happy woman."
"It'll save you a good deal of trouble," Mr. Pickwick went on, "and when I'm in town you'll always have somebody to sit with you."
"Oh, you dear," said Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick started. "Oh, you kind, good, playful dear," said Mrs. Bardell, and flung herself on his neck with a cataract of tears. The astonished Mr. Pickwick struggled violently, pleading and reproving, but in vain. Mrs. Bardell clung the tighter, and exclaiming frantically that she would never leave him, fainted away in his arms. At the same moment Tupman, Winkle, and Snodgrass entered the room. Mr. Pickwick tried to explain, but in their faces he read that they suspected him of making love to the widow. This reflection made him miserable and ill at ease. He lost no time in taking Sam Weller into his service, on condition that he travel with the Pickwickians in their further search for adventures, and at once proposed to his 3 comrades another journey. Next day, therefore, found them on the road for Eatanswill, a town near London which was then on the eve of a political election. This was a very exciting struggle, and interested them greatly. Here, one morning soon after their arrival, a fancy-dress breakfast was given by Mrs. Leo Hunter, a lady who had once written an Ode to an Expiring Frog, and who made a great point of knowing everybody who was at all celebrated for anything. All of the Pickwickians attended the breakfast. Mr. Pickwick's dignity was too great for him to don a fancy costume, but the rest wore them, Tupman going as a bandit in a green velvet coat with a 2-inch tail. Mrs. Leo Hunter herself, in the character of Minerva, insisted on presenting Mr. Pickwick to all the guests. In the midst of the gaiety, Mrs. Leo Hunter's husband called out, "My dear, here comes Mr. Fitzmarshall." And to his astonishment, Mr. Pickwick heard a well-known voice exclaiming, "Coming, my dear mum, crowds of people, full room, hard work, very." It was Jingle. Mr. Pickwick indignantly faced him, but the impostor at the first glance turned and fled. Mr. Pickwick, after hurriedly questioning his hostess, who told him Mr. Fitzmarshall lived at an inn in a village not far away, left the entertainment instantly, bent on pursuit. With Sam Weller, his faithful servant, he took the next stage-coach, and nightfall found him lodged in a room in that very inn, while Sam set himself to discover Jingle's whereabouts. With the money Mr. Wardle had paid him, Jingle had set up as a gentleman. He even had a servant, a sneaking fellow with a sallow, solemn face and lank hair, named Job Trotter, who could burst into tears whenever it suited his purpose, and whose favourite occupation seemed to be reading a hymn-book. Sam Weller soon picked an acquaintance with Job, and it was not long before the latter confided to him that Jingle, his master, whom he pretended to think very wicked, had plotted to run away that same night with a beautiful young lady from a boarding school just outside the village, at which he was a frequent caller. Job said his master was such a villain that he had made up his mind to betray him. Sam took Job to Mr. Pickwick, to whom he repeated his tale, adding that he and his master were to be let into the school building at 10 o'clock, and that if Mr. Pickwick would climb over the garden wall and tap on the kitchen door a little before midnight, he, Job, would let him in to catch Jingle in the very act of eloping. This seemed to Mr. Pickwick a good plan, and he proceeded to act upon it. In good time that night Sam hoisted him over the high garden wall of the school, after which he returned to the inn, while his master stealthily approached the building. It was very still. When the church chimes struck 11:30, Mr. Pickwick tapped on the door. Instead of being opened by Job, however, a servant girl appeared with a candle. Mr. Pickwick had presence of mind enough to hide behind the door as she opened it. She concluded the noise must have been the cat. Mr. Pickwick did not know what was best to do. To make matters worse, a thunderstorm broke, and he had no refuge from the rain. He was thoroughly drenched before he dared repeat the signal. This time windows were thrown open, and frightened voices demanded, "Who's there?" Mr. Pickwick was in a dreadful situation. He could not retreat, and when the door was timidly opened and someone screamed, "A man!" there was a dreadful chorus of shrieks from the lady principal, 3 teachers, 5 female servants, and 30 young lady boarders, all half dressed and in a forest of curl papers. Mr. Pickwick was desperate. He protested that he was no robber, that he would even consent to be tied or locked up, only to convince them. A closet stood in the hall. As a pledge of good faith he stepped inside it. Its door was quickly locked, and only then the trembling principal consented to listen to him. By the time he had told his story, he knew that he had been cruelly hoaxed by Jingle and Job Trotter. She knew not even the name of Mr. Fitzmarshall. For her own part, she was certain Mr. Pickwick was crazy, and he had to stay in the stuffy closet over an hour, while at his request someone was sent to find Sam Weller. The latter came at length, bringing with him old Mr. Wardle, who, as it happened, unknown to Mr. Pickwick, was stopping at the inn. Explanations were made, and Mr. Pickwick, choking with wrath, returned to the inn to find Jingle and his servant gone, and to be himself, for some time thereafter, a prey to rheumatism. A serious matter at this juncture called Mr. Pickwick home. This was a legal summons notifying him that Mrs. Bardell, his landlady, had brought a suit for damages against him, claiming he had promised to marry her and had then run away. A firm of tricky lawyers had persuaded her to this, in the hope of getting some money out of it themselves. Mr. Pickwick was very angry, but there was nothing for it but to hire a lawyer, so he and Sam Weller set out without delay. 4. Sam Weller meets his father, and the pursuit of Jingle is continued. Mr. Pickwick makes a strange call on a middle-aged lady in yellow curl papers. Having arranged this matter in London, master and servant sat one evening in a public house, when Sam recognised in a stout man with his face buried in a quart pot his own father, old Tony Weller, the stagecoach driver, and with great affection introduced him to Mr. Pickwick. "How's mother-in-law?" asked Sam. The elder Mr. Weller shook his head as he replied, "I've done it once too often, Samuel. Take example by your father, my boy, and be very careful o' widders, especially if they've kept a public house." Mrs. Weller the second indeed was the proprietress of a public house. To a shrill voice and a complaining disposition she added a dismal sort of piety which showed itself in much going to meeting, in considering her husband a lost and sinful wretch, and in the entertaining of a prim-faced, red-nosed, rusty old hypocrite of a preacher who sat by her fireside every evening consuming quantities of toast and pineapple rum, and groaning at the depravity of her husband, who declined to give money to the Preachers' Society for sending flannel waistcoats and coloured handkerchiefs to the infant negroes of the West Indies. As may be imagined, Sam's father led a sorry life at home. The meeting with the elder Weller proved a fortunate one, for when Sam told of their experiences with Jingle and Job Trotter, his father declared that he himself had driven the pair to the town of Ipswich, where they were then living. Nothing would satisfy Mr. Pickwick when he heard this but pursuit, and he and Sam set out next morning by coach, Mr. Pickwick having written to the other Pickwickians to follow him. On the coach was a red-haired man with an inquisitive nose and blue spectacles, whose name was Mr. Peter Magnus, and with whom, since they stopped at the same inn, Mr. Pickwick dined on his arrival. Mr. Magnus, before they parted for the night, grew confidential, and informed him that he had come there to propose to a lady who was in the inn at that very moment. For some time after he retired, Mr. Pickwick sat in his bedroom thinking. At length he rose to undress, when he remembered he had left his watch downstairs, and taking a candle he went to get it. He found it easily, but to retrace his steps proved more difficult. A dozen doors he thought his own, and a dozen times he turned a doorknob, only to hear a gruff voice within. At last he found what he thought was his own room, the door ajar. The wind had blown out his candle, but the fire was bright, and Mr. Pickwick, as he retired behind the bed curtains to undress, smiled till he almost cracked his nightcap strings as he thought of his wanderings. Suddenly the smile faded. Someone had entered the room and locked the door. "Robbers!" thought Mr. Pickwick. He peered out between the curtains and almost fainted with horror. Standing before the mirror was a middle-aged lady in yellow curl-papers, brushing her back hair. "Bless my soul!" thought Mr. Pickwick. "I must be in the wrong room. This is fearful." He waited a while, then coughed, first gently, then more loudly. "Gracious heaven!" said the middle-aged lady. "What's that?" It's only a gentleman, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick. "A strange man!" exclaimed the lady with a terrific scream. Mr. Pickwick put out his head in desperation. "Wretch!" she said, covering her face with her hands. "What do you want here?" "Nothing, ma'am. Nothing whatever, ma'am," said Mr. Pickwick earnestly. "I am almost ready to sink, ma'am, beneath the confusion of addressing a lady in my nightcap." Here the lady snatched off hers. "But I can't get it off, ma'am." Here Mr. Pickwick gave it a tremendous tug. "It is evident to me now that I have mistaken this bedroom for my own." "If this be true," said the lady, sobbing violently, "you will leave it instantly." "Certainly, ma'am," answered Mr. Pickwick, appearing. I am very sorry, ma'am." The lady pointed to the door. With his hat on over his nightcap, his shoes in his hand, and his coat over his arm, Mr. Pickwick opened the door, dropping both shoes with a crash. "I trust, ma'am," he resumed, bowing very low, "that my unblemished character—" But before he could finish the sentence, the lady had thrust him into the hall and bolted the door. Luckily, Mr. Pickwick met, coming along the corridor, the faithful Sam Weller, who took him safely to his room. 5. The Pickwickians find themselves in the grasp of the law, the final exposure of Jingle, and a Christmas merrymaking. Mr. Pickwick was still indoors next morning, when Sam, strolling through the town, met, coming from a certain garden gate, the wily Job Trotter. Job tried at first to disguise himself by making a horrible face, but Sam was not to be deceived, and finding this trick vain, the other burst into tears of joy to see him. Job told Sam that his master, Jingle, had bribed the mistress of the boarding school to deny to Mr. Pickwick that she knew him, and had then cruelly deserted the beautiful young lady for a richer one. But this time Sam was too wise to believe anything Job said. Meanwhile, in the inn, Mr. Pickwick was giving Mr. Peter Magnus some good advice as to the best method of proposing. The latter finally plucked up his courage, saw the lady, proposed to her, and was accepted. In his gratitude he insisted on taking Mr. Pickwick to be introduced to her. The instant he saw her, however, Mr. Pickwick uttered an exclamation, and the lady, with a slight scream, hid her face in her hands. She was none other than the owner of the room into which Mr. Pickwick had intruded the night before. Mr. Peter Magnus, in astonishment, demanded where and when they had seen each other before. This the lady declared she would not reveal for the world, and Mr. Pickwick likewise refusing, the other flew into a jealous rage, which ended in his rushing from the room, swearing he would challenge Mr. Pickwick to mortal combat. Tupman, Winkle, and Snodgrass being announced at that moment, Mr. Pickwick joined them, and the middle-aged lady was left alone in a state of terrible alarm. The longer she thought, the more terrified she became at the idea of possible bloodshed and harm to her lover. At length, overcome by dread and knowing no other way to stop the duel, she hastened to the house of the mayor of the town, a pompous magistrate named Nupkins, and begged him to stop the duel. Not wishing to make trouble for Mr. Peter Magnus, she declared that the two rioters who threatened to disturb the peace of the town were named Pickwick and Tupman. These two, Nupkins, thinking them cutthroats from London, at once sent men to arrest. Mr. Pickwick was just telling his followers the story of his mishap of the night before, when a half-dozen officers burst into the room. Boiling with indignation, Mr. Pickwick had to submit, and the officers put him and Tupman into an old sedan chair and carried them off, followed by Winkle and Snodgrass and by all the town loafers. Sam Weller met the procession and tried to rescue them, but was knocked down and taken prisoner also, so they were all brought to Nupkins's house. The mayor refused to hear a word Mr. Pickwick said, and was about to send them all to jail as desperate characters, when Sam Weller called his master aside and whispered to him that the house they were in was the very one from which he had seen Job Trotter come, and from this fact he guessed that Jingle himself had wormed himself into the good graces of the mayor. At this Mr. Pickwick asked to have a private talk with Nupkins. This was grudgingly granted, and in a few moments Mr. Pickwick had learned that Jingle, calling himself Captain Fitz-Marshall, had imposed so well on the pompous mayor that the latter's wife and daughter had introduced him everywhere, and he himself had boasted to everybody of his acquaintance. It was Nupkins's turn to feel humble when Mr. Pickwick told him Jingle's real character. He was terribly afraid the story would get out, and that the town would laugh at him, so he became all at once tremendously polite, declared their arrest had been all a mistake, and begged the Pickwickians to make themselves at home. Sam Weller was sent down to the kitchen to get his dinner, where he met a pretty housemaid named Mary, with whom he proceeded to fall very much in love for the first time in his life. Jingle and Job walked into the trap a little later, not expecting the kind of reception they were to find there. But even before the combined scorn of Nupkins, Mrs. Nupkins, Miss Nupkins, and the Pickwickians, Jingle showed a brazen front. He knew pride would prevent the mayor from exposing him, and when finally shown the door, he left with a mocking jeer, followed by the chuckling Job. In spite of his own troubles, Mr. Pickwick left Ipswich comforted by the defeat of Jingle. As for Sam, he kissed the pretty housemaid behind the door, and they parted with mutual regrets. To atone for these difficult adventures, the Pickwickians prepared for a long visit to Dingley Dell, where they spent an old-fashioned merry Christmas, where they found the fat boy even fatter and Mr. Wardle even jollier, where Tupman was not saddened by the sight of his lost love, the spinster aunt, who had been sent to live with another relative, where Snodgrass came more than ever to admire Emily, the pretty daughter, where Winkle fell head over ears in love with a black-eyed young lady visitor named Arabella Allen, who wore a nice little pair of boots with fur around the top, where they went skating and Mr. Pickwick broke through and had to be carried home and put to bed, where they hung mistletoe and told stories and altogether enjoyed themselves in 100 ways. Ben Allen, Arabella's brother, reached Dingley Dell on Christmas Day, a thick-set, mildewy young man with short black hair, a long white face and spectacles. He was a medical student, and brought with him his chum Bob Sawyer, a slovenly, smart, swaggering young gentleman who smelled strongly of tobacco smoke and looked like a dissipated Robinson Crusoe. Ben intended that his chum should marry his sister Arabella, and Bob Sawyer paid her so much attention that Winkle began to hate him on the spot. The Christmas merrymaking was all too soon over, and as Mrs. Bardell's lawsuit against Mr. Pickwick was shortly to be tried, the Pickwickians returned regretfully to the city. 6. The celebrated case of Bardell against Pickwick, Sergeant Buzzfuzz's speech, and an unexpected verdict. On the morning of the trial, Mr. Pickwick went to court, certain that the outcome would be in his favour. The room was full of people, and all the Pickwickians were there when he arrived. The judge was a very short man, so plump that he seemed all face and waistcoat. When he had rolled in upon 2 little turned legs and sat down at his desk, all you could see of him was 2 little eyes, 1 broad pink face, and about half of a comical big wig. Scarcely had the jurors taken their seats when Mrs. Bardell's lawyers brought in the lady herself, half hysterical, and supported by 2 tearful lady friends. The ushers called for silence, and the trial began. The lawyer who spoke for Mrs. Bardell was named Sergeant Buzzfuzz, a blustering man with a fat body and a red face. He began by picturing Mr. Pickwick's housekeeper as a lonely widow who had been heartlessly deceived by the villainy of her lodger. He declared that for 2 years Mrs. Bardell had attended to Mr. Pickwick's comforts, that once he had patted her little boy on the head and asked him how he would like to have another father, that he had also asked her to marry him, and on the same day had been seen by 3 of his friends holding her in his arms and soothing her agitation. Drawing forth 2 scraps of paper, Sergeant Buzzfuzz went on.
Gentlemen, 1 word more. 2 letters have passed between these parties which speak volumes. They are not open, fervent letters of affection. They are sly, underhanded communications, evidently intended by Pickwick to mislead and delude anyone into whose hands they might fall. Let me read the first. Dear Mrs. B., chops and tomato sauce. Yours, Pickwick. Gentlemen, what does this mean? Chops? Gracious heavens! And tomato sauce. Gentlemen, Is the happiness of a trusting female to be trifled away by such shallow tricks? The next has no date. Dear Mrs. B., I shall not be at home till to-morrow. And then follows this remarkable expression, don't trouble yourself about the warming pan. The warming pan! Why is Mrs. Bardell begged not to trouble herself about this warming pan, unless, as is no doubt the case, it is a mere substitute for some endearing word or promise cunningly used by Pickwick with a view to his intended desertion? But enough of this, gentlemen. It is hard to smile with an aching heart. My client's hopes are ruined. All is gloom in the house. The child's sports are forgotten while his mother weeps. But Pickwick, gentlemen, Pickwick the pitiless destroyer, Pickwick who comes before you to-day with his heartless tomato sauce and warming pans, Pickwick still rears his head and gazes without a sigh on the ruins he has made. Damages, gentlemen, heavy damages is the only punishment with which you can visit him. And for these damages, my client now appeals to a high-minded, a right-feeling, a sympathizing jury of her countrymen."
With this, Sergeant Buzfuz stopped and began to call his witnesses. The first was one of Mrs. Bardell's female cronies, whose testimony, of course, was all in her favour. Then Winkle was called. Knowing that he was a friend of Mr. Pickwick's, Mrs. Bardell's lawyers browbeat and puzzled him till poor Mr. Winkle had the air of a disconcerted pickpocket and was in a terrible state of confusion. He was soon made to tell how, with Tupman and Snodgrass, he had come into Mr. Pickwick's lodgings one day to find him holding Mrs. Bardell in his arms. The other two Pickwickians were also compelled to testify to this. Nor was this all. Sergeant Buzfuz finally entrapped the agonized Winkle into telling how Mr. Pickwick had been found at night in the wrong room at the Ipswich Inn, and how as a result a lady's marriage had been broken off and the whole party arrested and taken before the mayor. Poor Winkle was obliged to tell this, though he knew it would hurt the case of Mr. Pickwick. When he was released he rushed away to the nearest inn, where he was found some hours later by the waiter, groaning dismally with his head under the sofa cushions. Mr. Pickwick's case looked black. The only comfort he received was from the testimony of Sam Weller, who tried to do Mrs. Bardell's side all possible harm, yet say as little about his master as he could, and who kept the courtroom in a roar of laughter with his sallies. "Do you mean to tell me, Mr. Weller," said Sergeant Buzfuz finally, "that you saw nothing of Mrs. Bardell's fainting in the arms of Mr. Pickwick? Have you a pair of eyes, Mr. Weller?" "Yes, I have a pair of eyes," replied Sam, "and that's just it. If they was a pair of patent double-million magnifying gas miscroscopes of hextra power, perhaps I might be able to see through a flight of stairs and a deal door. But being only eyes, you see, my vision's limited." Sergeant Buzfuz could make nothing out of Sam, and so the case for Mrs. Bardell closed. Mr. Pickwick's lawyer made a long speech in his favour, but it was of no use. The evidence seemed all against him. The jury found him guilty of breach of promise of marriage, and sentenced him to pay Mrs. Bardell her damages. Mr. Pickwick was speechless with indignation. He vowed that not one penny would he ever pay if he spent the rest of his life in a jail. His own lawyer warned him that if he did not pay within 2 months, Mrs. Bardell's lawyers could put him into the debtors' prison, but Mr. Pickwick prepared to start on another excursion with his 3 friends, still declaring that he would never pay. 7. Winkle has an exciting adventure with Mr. Dowler, and with the aid of Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller discovers the whereabouts of Miss Arabella Allen. At Bath, a resort very popular with people of fashion, the Pickwickians decided to spend the next 2 months, and started by coach at once, accompanied by Sam Weller. On the coach they fell in with a fierce-looking, abrupt gentleman named Dowler, with a bald, glossy forehead and large black whiskers, who introduced them to the society of Bath, particularly to Mr. Angelo Cyrus Bantam, master of ceremonies at the famous Assembly Room where the fashionable balls were held. Mr. Bantam carried a gold eyeglass, a gold snuff-box, gold rings on his finger, a gold watch in his waistcoat pocket, a gold chain, and an ebony cane with a gold head. His linen was the whitest, his wig the blackest, and his teeth were so fine that it was hard to tell the real ones from the false ones. Mr. Bantam made the Pickwickians welcome, and in 3 days' time they were settled in a fine house, where Mr. and Mrs. Dowler also lodged. Mr. Pickwick passed his days in drinking the spring water for which Bath was famous, and in walking. His evenings he spent at the Assembly balls, at the theatre, or in making entries in his journal. One evening Mrs. Dowler was carried off to a party in her sedan chair, leaving her husband to sit up for her. The Pickwickians had long since gone to bed, and Mr. Dowler fell fast asleep while he waited. It was a very windy night, and the sedan carriers who brought the lady home knocked in vain at the door. Mr. Dowler did not wake, though they knocked like an insane postman. At length Winkle in his own room was roused by the racket. He donned slippers and dressing-gown, hurried downstairs half asleep, and opened the door. At the glare of the torches he jumped to the conclusion that the house was on fire, and rushed outside, when the door blew shut behind him. Seeing a lady's face at the window of the sedan chair, he turned and knocked at the door frantically, but with no response. He was undressed, and the wind blew his dressing-gown in a most unpleasant manner.
"There are people coming down the street now. There are ladies with them. Cover me up with something. Stand before me,"
roared Winkle, but the chairman only laughed. The ladies were nearer, and in desperation he bolted into the sedan chair where Mrs. Dowler was. Now Mr. Dowler, a moment before, had bounced off the bed, and now threw open the window just in time to see this. He thought his wife was running away with another man, and seizing a supper knife, the indignant husband tore into the street, shouting furiously. Winkle, hearing his horrible threats, did not wait. He leapt out of the sedan chair and took to his heels, hotly pursued by Dowler. He dodged his pursuer at length, rushed back, slammed the door in Dowler's face, gained his bedroom, barricaded his door with furniture, and packed his belongings. At the first streak of dawn he slipped out and took coach for Bristol. Mr. Pickwick was greatly vexed over Winkle's unheroic flight. Sam Weller soon discovered where he had gone, and Mr. Pickwick sent him after the fugitive, bidding him find Winkle and either compel him to return or keep him in sight until Mr. Pickwick himself could follow. Winkle, meanwhile, walking about the Bristol streets, chanced to stop at a doctor's office to make some inquiries, and in a young medical gentleman in green spectacles recognised, to his huge surprise, Bob Sawyer, the bosom friend of Ben Allen, both of whom he had met on Christmas Day at Dingley Dell. Bob, in delight, dragged Winkle into the back room where sat Ben Allen, amusing himself by boring holes in the chimney-piece with a red-hot poker. The precious couple had in fact set up shop together, and were using every trick they knew to make people think them great doctors with a tremendous practice. They insisted on Winkle staying to supper, and it was lucky he did so, for he heard news of Arabella, the pretty girl who had worn the little boots with fur around the top at Dingley Dell, and with whom he had fallen in love. He learned that Arabella had scorned the sprightly Bob Sawyer, and that her brother, in anger, had taken her away from Mr. Wardle's and put her in the house of an old aunt, a dull, close place not far from Bristol. Before he bade them good night, Winkle had determined to find her. He met with a shock on returning to his inn, to come suddenly upon Dowler sitting in the coffee-room. Winkle drew back, very pale, and was greatly surprised to see the bloodthirsty Dowler do likewise, as, growing even paler than Winkle, he began an apology for his action of the evening before. As a matter of fact, Dowler had run away from Bath too at dawn, in fear of Winkle, and thought now the latter had pursued him. Winkle, suspecting this, put on a look of great fierceness, but accepted the apology, and the pair shook hands. Winkle's plan for finding Arabella Allen met now with a setback. Sam Weller arrived at midnight, and insisted that Winkle be waked at once. Once in his room, Sam told him Mr. Pickwick's instructions, and declared he would not leave his sight till Winkle came back with him to Bath. This was awkward, but luckily Mr. Pickwick himself, to whom Sam wrote, arrived next day and released his follower. Mr. Pickwick approved of Winkle's determination to find the pretty Arabella, and so the next morning Sam Weller was sent on a voyage of discovery among the servants of the town. For many hours Sam searched in vain without a clue. In the afternoon he sat in a lane running between rows of gardens in one of the suburbs, when a gate opened and a maidservant came out to shake some carpets. Sam gallantly rose to help her, when she uttered a half-suppressed scream. It was Mary, the good-looking housemaid whom Sam had kissed at the house of Nupkins, the mayor of Ipswich, on the day of the arrest of the Pickwickians and the exposure of Jingle. She had left her place there for this new situation. When Sam had finished his gallant speeches, and Mary her blushing, he told her of Winkle's search. What was his surprise when she told him that Arabella was living the very next door. She let Sam come into the garden, and presently, when Arabella came out to walk, he scrambled onto the wall and pleaded Winkle's cause.
"Ve thought ve should have been obliged to straight-vesket him last night," he declared. "He's been a raving all day, and he says if he can't see you afore to-morrow night's over, he vishes he may be something unpleasanted if he don't drown hisself."
Arabella, in great distress at this prospect, promised she would be in the garden next evening, and Sam returned with the news to Mr. Pickwick and Winkle. The next evening all three set out for the spot. Mary let them into the garden, and while Winkle climbed the wall to throw himself at Arabella's feet, Mr. Pickwick kept guard at the gate with a dark lantern. So far he threw its beam that a scientific gentleman who lived a few houses away, seeing the light from his window, took it for some new and wonderful freak of electricity, and came out to investigate. Before he arrived, however, Winkle had scrambled back over the wall, and Arabella had run into the house. Seeing the scientific gentleman's head poked out of a garden gate as they passed, Sam gave it a gentle tap with his fist, and then, hoisting Mr. Pickwick on his back and followed by Winkle, he ran off at full speed, leaving the scientific gentleman to go back to his room and write a long article about the wonderful light, and to tell how he had received a shock of electricity which left him stunned for a quarter of an hour afterward. The Pickwickians' stay at Bath came to an end soon after this adventure, and their leader, with Sam Weller, returned to London. 8. Mr. Pickwick's experiences in the debtor's prison, where he finds an old enemy and heaps coals of fire on the head of Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick had not been long in London when his lawyer's warning proved too true. One morning a bailiff forced his way to his bedroom, and since he had not paid the damages to Mrs. Bardell, arrested him in bed, waited till he was dressed, and carried him off to the debtor's prison. The prison was called the Fleet. It was a gloomy building with a heavy gate guarded by a turnkey, holding all classes from labouring men to broken-down spendthrifts. Its filthy galleries and low coffee-room reeked with tobacco smoke, and its open court was noisy with the oaths of card-players. In some of the rooms lived men with their wives and whole families of children, and Mr. Pickwick found he would have to pay extra even to have a room to himself. Caged with this coarse, vulgar crowd, Mr. Pickwick suffered greatly, but no idea of paying the unjust damages entered his mind. Instead, he busied himself with wandering about the prison and learning all he could of its customs and inmates. Those who, like himself, had money were well treated. Those who had none lived in starvation and wretchedness. In one wall was a kind of iron cage, within which was posted a lean and hungry prisoner who rattled a money-box and called out, "Remember the poor debtors." The money he collected from passers-by in the street was divided and bought food for the poorest. As Mr. Pickwick entered the room given over to the latter class, he started. In one of its occupants, clad in tattered garments and yellow shirt, pinched with starvation and pale with illness, he saw Alfred Jingle. And near him, faithful still in rags and dirt, was Job Trotter. Jingle was no longer jaunty and impudent. He had pawned all his belongings, had lived, in fact, for the last week on a silk umbrella with an ivory handle. His smile now was a mere twitch of the face as he said, "Nothing soon. Starve. Die. Workhouse funeral. Serve him right. All over. Drop the curtain." Unable, however, to keep up this make-believe recklessness, Jingle sat down at length and sobbed like a child. Mr. Pickwick was greatly moved at the sight, and gave Job some money for his master as he turned away. Sam Weller had come with Mr. Pickwick to the prison. The latter, however, told his servant he must now leave him, though his wages would go on as usual. Sam pretended to agree, but lost no time in going to his father with a plan by which he too should be sent to the Fleet prison for debt, so as to be near his master. He borrowed some money from the old stage-driver, and then, when he refused to pay it, his father had him arrested and sent to the prison as he wished. Old Tony Weller and all his friends went with him, and gave him 3 tremendous cheers at the door. When Mr. Pickwick saw Sam return and learned what he had done, he was much affected at the devotion of this faithful servant, and felt himself more fond of him than ever. It was a long time before Winkle, Tupman, and Snodgrass learned of their leader's imprisonment and came to see him. Sam also had visitors in the person of his mother-in-law, who of course did not know he had brought about his own arrest, and the hypocritical red-nosed preacher who came with her to lecture him on his evil ways. Old Tony Weller came too, with a plan that he had thought of for Mr. Pickwick's escape in a piano.
"It'll hold him easy," he whispered, "with his hat and shoes on, and breathe through the legs, which is holler. Have a passage ready taken for 'Merica. The American government will never give him up when they finds as he's got money to spend, Sammy. Let him stop there till Mrs. Bardell's dead, then let him come back and write a book about the 'Mericans as'll pay all his expenses and more if he blows 'em up enough."
But Mr. Pickwick did not avail himself of this plan to escape to America. Day by day he wandered about the prison, learning its tales of misery and hopelessness, till his head and his heart ached and he could bear no more. For 3 months he remained there, shut up all day, stealing from his room only at night, and no entreaties would induce him to pay the money which was keeping him a prisoner. Mrs. Bardell's lawyers, meanwhile, grew impatient. They had not been paid even the costs of the trial, and these Mrs. Bardell had agreed to pay if they won the suit. As Mr. Pickwick had not paid the damages, however, she had no money, and so the lawyers at last had her arrested, and she too was sent to the Fleet Prison. After a few hours there, Mrs. Bardell was willing to do anything to escape, and she agreed, if Mr. Pickwick paid the costs, to release him from the damages. Mr. Pickwick was still so indignant that he would possibly not have consented, but at this juncture Winkle entered, leading by the hand the beautiful girl who had been Arabella Allen, but whom he introduced now as Mrs. Winkle. He had run away with her from the old aunt's house, with the help of Mary, the pretty housemaid, and they had been married without the knowledge of Winkle's father. They had come to Mr. Pickwick to beg him to go and plead with old Mr. Winkle for forgiveness. Arabella's tears and Winkle's plight proved too much for Mr. Pickwick's resolution. He paid Mrs. Bardell's costs and left Fleet Prison that very day, with Sam Weller, whose father, of course, immediately released him also. 9. Snodgrass gets into difficulties but wins his lady love. The adventures of the Pickwickians come to an end. Mr. Pickwick journeyed first to Bristol to break the news of Arabella's marriage to her brother, Ben Allen. The latter was angry at first, but finally he and Bob Sawyer shook hands with the visitor and agreed to treasure no ill feeling. Both the young gentlemen insisted on going with Mr. Pickwick to the Winkle homestead, a circumstance which did not make that visit an easy one. Arabella's brother went fast asleep in the parlour while they waited, and when Bob Sawyer pinched him as the old gentleman entered, he awoke with a shriek without the least idea where he was. This was most embarrassing to Mr. Pickwick, but he said all he could for Winkle. The old gentleman, however, would send no message to his son, and Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller returned with disappointment. In London, Sam found a letter awaiting him from his father. His mother-in-law was dead, and the public house and its earnings were now the old stage driver's. Sam went to see old Tony and found him terrified. All the widows in town were setting their caps for him, and he was afraid one of them would succeed in marrying him. He had determined to sell out the business, give the money to Mr. Pickwick to invest for him, and keep to stage driving so as to be safe. While Sam sat with his father talking matters over, the red-nosed preacher came sidling in to inquire whether Mrs. Weller's will had not left some money for him. He felt so much at home that he went to the cupboard and poured himself out a big tumbler of his favourite pineapple rum. This was more than old Tony Weller could stand. He fell upon the old hypocrite, kicked him through the door, and ducked him in the horse trough. Mr. Pickwick, meanwhile, had been arranging to buy the release of Jingle and Job Trotter, and to send them to the West Indies, where they might have a chance to make an honest living. While he was attending to this at his lawyer's, a prolonged knock came at the door. It was Joe, Mr. Wardle's fat boy, erect, but gone fast asleep between his knocks. Mr. Wardle came up from his carriage, delighted to see his old friend, of whose imprisonment he had just heard. He told Mr. Pickwick that his daughter Emily had fallen in love with Snodgrass, and that, discovering it, he had brought her to London to ask the advice of Mr. Pickwick in the matter. While they talked, he sent the fat boy back to the inn to tell Emily that Mr. Pickwick would dine there with them. The fat boy went on this errand, and coming suddenly into the inn sitting-room, discovered Emily with her waist encircled with Snodgrass's arm, while Arabella and her pretty housemaid were obligingly looking out of the window. There was but one thing to do. They bribed the fat boy not to tell. Snodgrass unluckily stayed too long. As he was leaving, he heard Mr. Wardle, with Mr. Pickwick and Winkle, coming up the stair. He was obliged to retreat, and took refuge in Mr. Wardle's bedroom, from which there was no escape save through the dining-room. The dinner hour was a painful one to Emily, for the fat boy's secret kept him awake, and he winked at her and at Arabella so often that Mr. Wardle noticed it. The latter sent him into the bedroom finally for his snuff-box, and he came out very pale, Mr. Snodgrass having seized him there and begged him to tell someone secretly to release him. Accordingly, the fat boy made desperate efforts to attract Mr. Pickwick's attention, first by making faces at him when he thought no one else was looking, and finally by running a pin into his leg. But this did not have the desired results. Mr. Pickwick concluded he was crazy, and Mr. Wardle was about to have him taken downstairs, when into the confusion, with a very red face, walked Snodgrass out of the bedroom. He explained his presence there, declared his love for Emily, was forgiven on the spot, and joined the dinner. The happiness of all was complete when old Mr. Winkle arrived, having made up his mind to see his son's wife and judge for himself, and found Arabella so sweet that he kissed her and forgave Winkle on the instant. Thus the last adventure of the Pickwickians ended happily. Mr. Pickwick had seen before this that the marriage of his companions would change his own life. He withdrew his name from the Pickwick Club, which thereupon went to pieces, and purchased a house near London for the entertainment of his friends. And there, a few days later, Snodgrass and Emily were married in the presence of Mr. Wardle and all the Pickwickians. After the wedding, Snodgrass bought a farm near Dingley Dell, where with Emily he lived many years, and was always accounted a great poet on account of his pensive and absent-minded manner. Winkle, with Arabella, settled a half-mile from Mr. Pickwick. Tupman never again fell in love, though for years his romantic air made him the admiration of numerous single ladies of the neighbourhood. Ben Allen and Bob Sawyer went to India as surgeons, where, after having had yellow fever 14 times, they became teetotalers, and thereafter did well. Mrs. Bardell continued to let lodgings to single gentlemen, but never had another breach of promise suit. Old Tony Weller finally gave up business, and retired to live on the interest of the money Mr. Pickwick had invested for him, having to the end of his life a great dislike for widows. His son Sam remaining faithful to his master, Mr. Pickwick at length made Mary, the pretty maid, his housekeeper, on condition that she marry Sam, which she did at once. Mr. Pickwick lived happily, occupied in writing his adventures and in acting as godfather to the children of Snodgrass and Winkle. He never regretted what he had done for Jingle and Job Trotter, who became in time worthy members of society. He was a favourite with all, and the children loved him. Every year he went to Mr. Wardle's to a large merrymaking, attended by his faithful Sam Weller, between whom and his master there was a regard that nothing but death could end. End of section 35. Recording by Ruth Golding.